discontent about your nature. Forgive yourself your own self. You have it in your power to merge everything you have lived through, false starts, errors, delusions, passions, your loves and your hopes, into your goal, with nothing left over. Preface. It is often enough, and always with great surprise, intimated to me that there is something both ordinary and unusual in all my writings, from the birth of tragedy to the recently published Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future. They all contain, I have been told, snares and nets for short-sighted birds, and something that is almost a constant, subtle incitement to an overturning of habitual opinions and of approved customs. What? Everything is merely human, all too human. With this exclamation, my writings are gone through, not without a certain dread and mistrust of ethic itself, and not without a disposition to ask the exponent of evil things if those things be not simply misrepresented. My writings have been termed a school of distrust, still more of disdain, also and more happily of courage, audacity even. And in fact, I myself do not believe that anybody ever looked into the world with a distrust as deep as mine, seeming as I do, not simply the timely advocate of the devil, but to employ theological terms, an enemy and challenger of God. And whosoever has experienced any of the consequences of such deep distrust, anything of the chills and the agonies of isolation, to which such an unqualified difference of standpoint condemns him endowed with it, will also understand how often I must have sought relief and self-forgetfulness from any source, through any object of veneration or enmity, of scientific seriousness or wanton lightness. Also why I, when I could not find what I was in need of, had to fashion it for myself, counterfeiting it or imagining it. And what poet or writer has ever done anything else? And what other purpose can all the art in the world possibly have? That which I always stood most in need of, in order to effect my cure and self-recovery, was faith. Faith enough not to be thus isolated, not to look at life from so singular a point of view, a magic apprehension in eye and mind of relationship and equality, a calm confidence in friendship, a blindness free from suspicion and questioning, to two-sidedness, a pleasure in externals, superficialities, the near, the accessible, in all things possessed of color, skin, and seeming. Perhaps I could be fairly reproached with much art in this regard, many fine counterfeitings. For example, that wisely or willfully I had shut my eyes to Schopenhauer's blind will towards ethic at a time when I was already clear-sighted enough on the subject of ethic. Likewise, that I had deceived myself concerning Richard Wagner's incurable romanticism, as if it were a beginning and not an end. Likewise concerning the Greeks, likewise concerning the Germans and their future, and there may be perhaps a long list of such likewises. Granted, however, that all this were true, and with justice urged against me, what does it signify? What can it signify in regard to how much of the self-sustaining capacity, how much of reason and higher protection are embraced in such self-deception, and how much more falsity is still necessary to me, that I may therewith always reassure myself regarding the luxury of my truth. Enough, I still live, and life is not considered now apart from ethic. It will have deception. It thrives, leapt on deception. But am I not beginning to do all over again what I have always done? I, the old immoralist and bird snarer, talk unmorally, ultra-morally, beyond good and evil. 2. Thus then have I evolved for myself the free spirits, to whom this discouraging, encouraging work, under the general title, Human, All Too Human, is dedicated. Such free spirits do not really exist, and never did exist. But I stood in need of them, as I have pointed out, in order that some good might be mixed with my evils. Illness, loneliness, strangeness, acedia, and incapacity to serve as gay spirits and comrades, with whom one may talk and laugh when one is disposed to talk and laugh, and whom one may send to the devil when they grow wearisome. They are some compensation for the lack of friends, that such free spirits can possibly exist, that our Europe will yet number among her sons, of tomorrow or of the day after tomorrow, such a brilliant and enthusiastic company, alive and palpable, and not merely, as in my case, phantasms and imaginary shades. I myself can by no means doubt. I see them already coming, slowly, slowly. May it not be that I am doing a little something to expedite their coming, when I describe in advance the influences under which I see them evolving, and the ways along which they travel. 3. It may be conjectured that a soul in which the type of free spirit can attain maturity and completeness had its decisive and deciding event in the form of a great emancipation or unbinding, and that prior to that event it seemed only the more firmly and forever chained to its place and pillar. What binds strongest? What cords seem almost unbreakable? In the case of mortals of a choice and lofty nature, they will be those of duty, that reverence which in youth is most typical, that timidity and tenderness in the presence of the traditionally honored and the worthy, that gratitude to the soil from which we sprung, for the hand that guided us, for the relic before which we were taught to pray. Their sublimest moments will themselves bind these souls most strongly. The great liberation comes suddenly to such prisoners, like an earthquake. The young soul is all at once shaken, torn apart, cast forth. It comprehends not itself what is taking place. An involuntary onward impulse rules them with the mastery of command. A will, a wish are developed to go forward, anywhere, at any price. A strong, dangerous curiosity regarding an undiscovered world flames and flashes in all their being. Better to die than live here, so sounds the tempting voice, and this here, this at home, constitutes all they have hitherto loved. A sudden dread and distrust of that which they loved, a flash of contempt for that which is called their duty, a mutinous, willful, volcanic-like longing for a faraway journey, strange scenes and people, annihilation, petrifaction, a hatred surmounting love, perhaps a sacrilegious impulse, and look backwards to where they so long prayed and loved, perhaps a flush of shame for what they did, and at the same time an exultation at having done it, an inner, intoxicating, delightful tremor in which is betrayed the sense of victory. A victory. Over what? Over whom? A riddle-like victory, fruitful in questioning and well worth questioning. But the first victory, for all. Such things of pain and ill belong to the history of the great liberation, and it is at the same time a malady that can destroy a man. This first outbreak of strength and will for self-destination, self-valuation, this will for free will, and how much illness is forced to the surface in the frantic strivings and singularities with which the freedman, the liberated, seeks henceforth to attest his mastery over things. He roves fiercely around with an unsatisfied longing, and whatever objects he may encounter must suffer from the perilous expectancy of his pride. He tears to pieces whatever attracts him. With a sardonic laugh, he overturns whatever he finds, veiled or protected by any reverential awe. He would see what these things look like when they are overturned. It is willfulness and delight in the willfulness of it, if he now, perhaps, gives his approval to that which has heretofore been in ill repute, if, in curiosity and experiment, he penetrates stealthily to the most forbidden things, in the background during all his plunging and roaming, for he is as restless and aimless in his course as if lost in a wilderness, is the interrogation mark of a curiosity growing ever more dangerous. Can we not upset every standard, and is good perhaps evil, and God only an invention and a subtlety of the devil? Is everything, in the last resort, false? And if we are dupes, are we not on that very account dupers also? Must we not be dupers also? Such reflections lead and mislead him, ever further on, ever further away. Solitude, that dread goddess and mater saeva cupidinum, encircles and besets him, ever more threatening, more violent, more heartbreaking. But who today knows what solitude is? 4. From this morbid solitariness, from the desert of such years of experiment, it is still a long way to the copious, overflowing safety and soundness, which does not care to dispense with disease itself as an instrument, an angling hook of knowledge, to that mature freedom of spirit, which is equally self-control and discipline of the heart, and gives access to many and opposed modes of thought, to that inward comprehensiveness and daintiness of superabundance, which excludes any danger of the spirit's becoming enamored and lost in its own paths, and lying intoxicated in some corner or other, to that excess of plastic, healing, formative, and restorative powers, which is exactly the sign of splendid health, that excess which gives the free spirit the dangerous prerogative of being entitled to live by experiments and offer itself to adventure, the free spirit's prerogative of mastership. Long years of convalescence may lie in between, years full of many-colored, painfully enchanting magical transformations, curbed and led by a tough will to health, which often dares to dress and disguise itself as actual health. There is a middle condition therein, which a man of such a fate never calls to mind later on without emotion. A pale, delicate light, and a sunshine happiness are peculiar to him, a feeling of bird-like freedom, prospect, and haughtiness, a tertium quid, in which curiosity and gentle disdain are combined. A free spirit, this cool expression does good in every condition, it almost warms. One no longer lives in the fetters of love and hatred, without yea, without nay, voluntarily near, voluntarily distant, preferring to escape, to turn aside, to flutter forth, to fly up and away. One is fastidious like everyone who has once seen an immense variety beneath him, and one has become the opposite of those who trouble themselves about things which do not concern them. In fact, it is nothing but things which now concern the free spirit, and how many things which no longer trouble him. 5. A step further towards recovery, and the free spirit again draws near to life, slowly it is true, and almost stubbornly, almost distrustfully. Again it grows warmer around him, and as it were yellower. Feeling and sympathy gain depth, thawing winds of every kind pass lightly over him. He almost feels as if his eyes were now first opened to what is near. He marvels and is still. Where has he been? The near and nearest things. How changed they appear to him. What a bloom and magic they have acquired meanwhile. He looks back gratefully, grateful to his wandering, his austerity and self-estrangement, his far-sightedness and his bird-like flights in cold heights. What a good thing that he did not always stay at home, by himself, like a sensitive, stupid tenderling. He has been beside himself, there is no doubt. He now sees himself for the first time, and what surprises he feels thereby, what thrills unexperienced hitherto, what joy even in the weariness, in the old illness, in the relapses of the convalescent, how he likes to sit still and suffer, to practice patience, to lie in the sun. Who is as familiar as he with the joy of winter, with the patch of sunshine upon the wall? They are the most grateful animals in the world, and also the most unassuming, these lizards of convalescence, with their faces half turned towards life once more. There are those amongst them who never let a day pass without hanging a little hymn of praise on its trailing fringe. And speaking seriously, it is a radical cure for all pessimism, the well-known disease of old idealists and falsehood mongers, to become ill after the manner of these free spirits, to remain ill a good while, and then grow well, better, for a still longer period. It is wisdom, practical wisdom, to prescribe even health for oneself for a long time, only in small doses. 6. About this time, it may at last happen, under the sudden illuminations of still disturbed and changing health, that the enigma of that great emancipation begins to reveal itself to the free and ever freer spirit, that enigma which had hitherto lain obscure, questionable, and almost intangible in his memory. If for a long time he scarcely dared to ask himself, why so apart, so alone, denying everything that I revered, denying reverence itself, why this hatred, this suspicion, this severity towards my own virtues? He now dares, and asks the questions aloud, and already hears something like an answer to them. Thou shouldest become master over thyself, and master also of thine own virtues. Formerly they were thy masters, but they are only entitled to be thy tools, amongst other tools. Thou shouldest obtain power over thy pro and contra, and learn how to put them forth, and withdraw them again in accordance with thy higher purpose. Thou shouldest learn how to take the proper perspective of every valuation, the shifting, distortion, and apparent teleology of the horizons, and everything that belongs to perspective, also the amount of stupidity which opposite values involve, and all the intellectual loss with which every pro and every contra has to be paid for. Thou shouldest learn how much necessary injustice there is in every for and against, injustice as inseparable from life, and life itself as conditioned by the perspective and its injustice. Above all, thou shouldest see clearly where the injustice is always greatest, namely where life has developed most punily, restrictedly, necessitously, and incipiently, and yet cannot help regarding itself as the purpose and standard of things, and for the sake of self-preservation, secretly, basely, and continuously wasting away, and calling in question the higher, greater, and richer. Thou shouldest see clearly the problem of gradation, of rank, and how power and right and amplitude of perspective grow up together. Thou shouldest. But enough. The free spirit knows henceforth which thou shalt he has obeyed, and also what he can now do, what he only now may do. 7. Thus doth the free spirit answer himself with regard to the riddle of emancipation, and ends therewith while he generalizes his case, in order thus to decide with regard to his experience. As it has happened to me, he says to himself, so must it happen to everyone in whom a mission seeks to embody itself and to come into the world. The secret power and necessity of this mission will operate in and upon the destined individuals like an unconscious pregnancy, long before they have had the mission itself in view and have known its name. destiny rules over us, even when we are not yet aware of it. It is the future that makes laws for our today. Granted that it is the problem of the gradations of rank, of which we may say that it is our problem, we free spirits. Now only in the midday of our life do we first understand what preparations, detours, tests, experiments, and disguises the problem needed before it was permitted to rise before us, and how we had first to experience the most manifold and opposing conditions of distress and happiness in soul and body, as adventurers and circumnavigators of the inner world called man, as surveyors of all the higher and the one above another, also called man, penetrating everywhere almost without fear, rejecting nothing, losing nothing, tasting everything, cleansing everything from all that is accidental, and as it were, sifting it out, until at last we could say, we free spirits. Here, a new problem. Here a long ladder, the rungs of which we ourselves have sat upon and mounted, which we ourselves at some time have been. Here a higher place, a lower place, and under us, an immeasurably long order, a hierarchy which we see. Here, our problem. 8. No psychologist or augur will be in doubt for a moment as to what stage of the development just described the following book belongs or is assigned to. But where are these psychologists nowadays? In France, certainly. Perhaps in Russia. Assuredly not in Germany. Reasons are not lacking why the present-day Germans could still even count this as an honor to them. Bad enough, surely, for one who in this respect is un-German in disposition and constitution. This German book, which has been able to find readers in a wide circle of countries and nations, it has been about 10 years going its rounds, and must understand some sort of music and piping art, by means of which even coy foreign ears are seduced into listening. It is precisely in Germany that this book has been most negligently read and worst listened to. What is the reason? It demands too much, I have been told. It appeals to men free from the pressure of coarse duties. It wants refined and fastidious senses. It needs superfluity of time, of clearness of sky and heart, of otium in the boldest sense of the term, purely good things, which we Germans of today do not possess, and therefore cannot give. After such a polite answer, my philosophy advises me to be silent, and not to question further. Besides, in certain cases, as the proverb points out, one only remains a philosopher by being silent. Nice. France. Spring 1886, Part 1. Of the first and last things. 1. The chemistry of the notions and the feelings. Philosophical problems, in almost all their aspects, present themselves in the same interrogative formula, now that they did 2,000 years ago. How can a thing develop out of its antithesis? For example, the reasonable from the non-reasonable, the animate from the inanimate, the logical from the illogical, altruism from egoism, disinterestedness from greed, truth from error. The metaphysical philosophy formerly steered itself clear of this difficulty, to such extent as to repudiate the evolution of one thing from another, and to assign a miraculous origin to what it deemed highest and best, due to the very nature and being of the thing in itself. The historical philosophy, on the other hand, which can no longer be viewed apart from physical science, the youngest of all philosophical methods, discovered experimentally, and its results will probably always be the same, that there is no antithesis whatever, except in the usual exaggerations of popular or metaphysical comprehension, and that an error of the reason is at the bottom of such contradiction. According to its explanation, there is, strictly speaking, neither unselfish conduct nor a wholly disinterested point of view. Both are simply sublimations, in which the basic element seems almost evaporated and betrays its presence only to the keenest observation. All that we need, and that could possibly be given us in the present state of development of the sciences, is a chemistry of the moral, religious, aesthetic conceptions and feeling, as well as of those emotions which we experience in the affairs, great and small, of society and civilization, and which we are sensible of, even in solitude. But what if this chemistry established the fact that even in its domain, the most magnificent results were attained with the basest and most despised ingredients? Would many feel disposed to continue such investigations? Mankind loves to put by the questions of its origin and beginning. Must one not be almost inhuman in order to follow the opposite course? 2. The traditional error of philosophers. All philosophers make the common mistake of taking contemporary man as their starting point, and of trying through an analysis of him to reach a conclusion. Man involuntarily presents himself to them as an eterna veritas, as a passive element in every hurly-burly, as a fixed standard of things. Yet everything uttered by the philosopher on the subject of man is, in the last resort, nothing more than a piece of testimony concerning man during a very limited period of time. Lack of the historical sense is the traditional defect in all philosophers. Many innocently take man in his most childish state, as fashioned through the influence of certain religious and even of certain political developments, as the permanent form under which man must be viewed. They will not learn that man has evolved, that the intellectual faculty itself is an evolution, whereas some philosophers make the whole cosmos out of this intellectual faculty. But everything essential in human evolution took place eons ago, long before the 4,000 years or so of which we know anything. During these, man may not have changed very much. However, the philosopher ascribes instinct to contemporary man, and assumes that this is one of the unalterable facts regarding man himself, and hence affords a clue to the understanding of the universe in general. The whole teleology is so planned that man during the last 4,000 years shall be spoken of as a being existing from all eternity, and with reference to whom everything in the cosmos, from its very inception, is naturally ordered. Yet everything evolved. There are no eternal facts, as there are no absolute truths. Accordingly, historical philosophizing is henceforth indispensable, and with it, honesty of judgment. 3. Appreciation of simple truths. It is the characteristic of an advanced civilization to set a higher value upon little, simple truths, ascertained by scientific method, than upon the pleasing and magnificent errors originating in metaphysical and aesthetical epochs and peoples. To begin with, the former are spoken of with contempt, as if there could be no question of comparison respecting them. So rigid, homely, prosaic, and even discouraging is the aspect of the first, while so beautiful, decorative, intoxicating, and perhaps beatific, appear the last named. Nevertheless, the hard one, the certain, the lasting, and therefore the fertile, in new knowledge, is the higher. To hold fast to it is manly and evinces courage, directness, endurance, and not only individual men, but all mankind will by degrees be uplifted to this manliness when they are finally habituated to the proper appreciation of tenable enduring knowledge and have lost all faith in inspiration and in the miraculous revelation of truth. The reverers of forms, indeed, with their standards of beauty and taste, may have good reason to laugh when the appreciation of little truths and the scientific spirit begin to prevail, but that will be only because their eyes are not yet opened to the charm of the utmost simplicity of form, or because men, though reared in the rightly appreciative spirit, will still not be fully permeated by it, so that they continue unwittingly imitating ancient forms, and that ill enough, as anybody does who no longer feels any interest in a thing. Formerly the mind was not brought into play through the medium of exact thought. Its serious business lay in the working out of forms and symbols. That has now changed. Any seriousness in symbolism is at present the indication of a deficient education. As our very acts become more intellectual, our tendencies more rational, and our judgment, for example, as to what seems reasonable, is very different from what it was 100 years ago. So the forms of our lives grow ever more intellectual, and to the old-fashioned eye, perhaps, uglier, but only because it cannot see that the richness of inner, rational beauty always spreads and deepens, and that the inner, rational aspect of all things should now be of more consequence to us than the most beautiful externality and the most exquisite limning. 4. Astrology and the like. It is presumable that the objects of the religious, moral, aesthetic, and logical notions pertain simply to the superficialities of things, although man flatters himself with the thought that here at least he is getting to the heart of the cosmos. He deceives himself because these things have power to make him so happy and so wretched, and so he evinces, in this respect, the same conceit that characterizes astrology. Astrology presupposes that the heavenly bodies are regulated in their movements in harmony with the destiny of mortals. The moral man presupposes that that which concerns himself most nearly must also be the heart and soul of things. 5. Misconception of dreams. In the dream, mankind, in epochs of crude, primitive civilization, thought they were introduced to a second, substantial world. Here we have the source of all metaphysic. Without the dream, men would never have been incited to an analysis of the world. Even the distinction between soul and body is wholly due to the primitive conception of the dream, as also the hypothesis of the embodied soul, whence the development of all superstition, and also probably the belief in God. The dead still live, for they appear to the living in dreams. So reasoned mankind at one time, and through many thousands of years. 6. The scientific spirit prevails only partially, not wholly. The specialized, minutest departments of science are dealt with purely objectively, but the general universal sciences, considered as a great, basic unity, posit the question, truly a very living question: to what purpose? What is the use? Because of this reference to utility, they are, as a whole, less impersonal than when looked at in their specialized aspects. Now, in the case of philosophy, as forming the apex of the scientific pyramid, this question of the utility of knowledge is necessarily brought very conspicuously forward, so that every philosophy has, unconsciously, the air of ascribing the highest utility to itself. It is for this reason that all philosophies contain such a great amount of high-flying metaphysic, and such a shrinking from the seeming insignificance of the deliverances of physical science. For the significance of knowledge in relation to life must be made to appear as great as possible. This constitutes the antagonism between the specialties of science and philosophy. The latter aims, as art aims, at imparting to life and conduct the utmost depth and significance. In the former, mere knowledge is sought, and nothing else, whatever else be incidentally obtained. Heretofore there has never been a philosophical system in which philosophy itself was not made the apologist of knowledge in the abstract. On this point at least, each is optimistic and insists that to knowledge the highest utility must be ascribed. They are all under the tyranny of logic, which is, from its very nature, optimism. 7. The discordant element in science. Philosophy severed itself from science when it put the question, what is that knowledge of the world and of life through which mankind may be made happiest? This happened when the Socratic school arose. With the standpoint of happiness, the arteries of investigating science were compressed too tightly to permit of any circulation of the blood, and are so compressed today. 8. Pneumatic, the spiritual. Explanation of nature. Metaphysic reads the message of nature as if it were written purely pneumatically, as the Church and its learned ones formerly did where the Bible was concerned. It requires a great deal of expertness to apply to nature, the same strict science of interpretation that the philologists have devised for all literature, and to apply it for the purpose of a simple, direct interpretation of the message, and at the same time not bring out a double meaning. But as in the case of books and literature, errors of exposition are far from being completely eliminated, and vestiges of allegorical and mystical interpretations are still to be met with in the most cultivated circles. So where nature is concerned, the case is actually much worse. 9. Metaphysical world. It is true, there may be a metaphysical world. The absolute possibility of it can scarcely be disputed. We see all things through the medium of the human head, and we cannot well cut off this head, although there remains the question what part of the world would be left after it had been cut off. But that is a purely abstract scientific problem, and one not much calculated to give men uneasiness. Yet everything that has heretofore made metaphysical assumptions valuable, fearful, or delightful to men, all that gave rise to them is passion, error, and self-deception. The worst systems of knowledge, not the best, pin their tenets of belief thereto. When such methods are once brought to view as the basis of all existing religions and metaphysics, they are already discredited. There always remains, however, the possibility already conceded, but nothing at all can be made out of that, to say not a word about letting happiness, salvation, and life hang upon the threads spun from such a possibility. Accordingly, nothing could be predicated of the metaphysical world beyond the fact that it is an elsewhere, another sphere, inaccessible and incomprehensible to us. It would become a thing of negative properties. Even were the existence of such a world absolutely established, it would nevertheless remain incontrovertible that of all kinds of knowledge, knowledge of such a world would be of least consequence, of even less consequence than knowledge of the chemical analysis of water would be to a storm-tossed mariner. 10. The harmlessness of metaphysic in the future. as soon as religion, art, and ethics are so understood that a full comprehension of them can be gained without taking refuge in the postulates of metaphysical claptrap at any point in the line of reasoning, there will be a complete cessation of interest in the purely theoretical problem of the thing in itself and the phenomenon. For here, too, the same truth applies. In religion, art, and ethics, we are not concerned with the essence of the cosmos. We are in the sphere of pure conception. No presentiment or intuition can carry us any further. With perfect tranquility, the question of how our conception of the world could differ so sharply from the actual world as it is manifest to us will be relegated to the physiological sciences and to the history of the evolution of ideas and organisms. 11. Language as a presumptive science. The importance of language in the development of civilization consists in the fact that by means of it, man placed one world, his own alongside another, a place of leverage that he thought so firm as to admit of his turning the rest of the cosmos on a pivot, that he might master it. Insofar as man for ages looked upon mere ideas and names of things as upon eterni veritates, he evinced the very pride with which he raised himself above the brute. He really supposed that in language he possessed a knowledge of the cosmos. The language builder was not so modest as to believe that he was only giving names to things. On the contrary, he thought he embodied the highest wisdom concerning things in mere words. And in truth, language is the first movement in all strivings for wisdom. Here too it is faith in ascertained truth from which the mightiest fountains of strength have flowed. Very tardily, only now, it dawns upon men that they have propagated a monstrous error in their belief in language. Fortunately, it is too late now to arrest and turn back the evolutionary process of the reason, which had its inception in this belief. Logic itself rests upon assumptions to which nothing in the world of reality corresponds. For example, the correspondence of certain things to one another and the identity of those things at different periods of time are assumptions pure and simple. But the science of logic originated in the positive belief that they were not assumptions at all, but established facts. It is the same with the science of mathematics, which certainly would never have come into existence if mankind had known from the beginning that in all nature there is no perfectly straight line, no true circle, no standard of measurement. 12. Dream and civilization. The function of the brain which is most encroached upon in slumber is the memory. Not that it is wholly suspended, but it is reduced to a state of imperfection, as in primitive ages of mankind was probably the case with everyone, whether waking or sleeping. Uncontrolled and entangled as it is, it perpetually confuses things as a result of the most trifling similarities. Yet in the same mental confusion and lack of control, the nations invented their mythologies, while nowadays travelers habitually observe how prone the savage is to forgetfulness, how his mind, after the least exertion of memory, begins to wander and lose itself, until finally he utters falsehood and nonsense from sheer exhaustion. Yet in dreams, we all resemble this savage. Inadequacy of distinction and error of comparison are the basis of the preposterous things we do and say in dreams, so that when we clearly recall a dream, we are startled that so much idiocy lurks within us. The absolute distinctness of all dream images, due to implicit faith in their substantial reality, recalls the conditions in which earlier mankind were placed, for whom hallucinations had extraordinary vividness, entire communities and even entire nations laboring simultaneously under them. Therefore, in sleep and in dream, we make the pilgrimage of early mankind over again. 13. Logic of the dream. During sleep, the nervous system, through various inner provocatives, is in constant agitation. Almost all the organs act independently and vigorously. The blood circulates rapidly. The posture of the sleeper compresses some portions of the body. The coverlets influence the sensations in different ways. The stomach carries on the digestive process and acts upon other organs thereby. The intestines are in motion. The position of the head induces unaccustomed action. The feet, shoeless, no longer pressing the ground, are the occasion of other sensations of novelty, as is indeed the changed garb of the entire body. All these things, following the bustle and change of the day, result, through their novelty, in a movement throughout the entire system that extends even to the brain functions. Thus there are 100 circumstances to induce perplexity in the mind, a questioning as to the cause of this excitation. Now the dream is a seeking and presenting of reasons for these excitations of feeling, of the supposed reasons, that is to say. Thus, for example, whoever has his feet bound with 2 threads will probably dream that a pair of serpents are coiled about his feet. This is at first a hypothesis, then a belief with an accompanying imaginative picture, and the argument. These snakes must be the causa of those sensations which I, the sleeper, now have. So reasons the mind of the sleeper. The conditions precedent, as thus conjectured, become, owing to the excitation of the fancy, present realities. Everyone knows from experience how a dreamer will transform one piercing sound, for example, that of a bell, into another of quite a different nature, say, the report of cannon. In his dream, he becomes aware first of the effects, which he explains by a subsequent hypothesis, and becomes persuaded of the purely conjectural nature of the sound. But how comes it that the mind of the dreamer goes so far astray, when the same mind, awake, is habitually cautious, careful, and so conservative in its dealings with hypotheses? Why does the first plausible hypothesis of the cause of a sensation gain credit in the dreaming state? For in a dream, we look upon that dream as reality, that is, we accept our hypotheses as fully established. I have no doubt that as men argue in their dreams today, mankind argued, even in their waking moments, for thousands of years. The first causa that occurred to the mind with reference to anything that stood in need of explanation was accepted as the true explanation, and served as such. Savages show the same tendency in operation as the reports of travelers agree. In the dream, this atavistic relic of humanity manifests its existence within us, for it is the foundation upon which the higher rational faculty developed itself and still develops itself in every individual. Dreams carry us back to the earlier stages of human culture and afford us a means of understanding it more clearly. Dream thought comes so easily to us now because we are so thoroughly trained to it through the interminable stages of evolution, during which this fanciful and facile form of theorizing has prevailed. To a certain extent, the dream is a restorative for the brain, which during the day is called upon to meet the many demands for trained thought made upon it by the conditions of a higher civilization. We may, if we please, become sensible, even in our waking moments, of a condition that is as a door and vestibule to dreaming. If we close our eyes, the brain immediately conjures up a medley of impressions, of light and color, apparently a sort of imitation and echo of the impressions forced in upon the brain during its waking moments, and now the mind, in cooperation with the imagination, transforms this formless play of light and color into definite figures, moving groups, landscapes. What really takes place is a sort of reasoning from effect back to cause, as the brain inquires whence these impressions of light and color it posits as the inducing causes of such lights and colors, those shapes and figures. They serve the brain as the occasions of those lights and colors, because the brain, when the eyes are open and the senses awake, is accustomed to perceiving the cause of every impression of light and color made upon it. Here again the imagination is continually interposing its images, inasmuch as it participates in the production of the impressions made through the senses day by day. And the dream fancy does exactly the same thing. That is, the presumed cause is determined from the effect, and after the effect, all this too with extraordinary rapidity, so that in this matter, as in a matter of jugglery or sleight of hand, a confusion of the mind is produced, and an after effect is made to appear a simultaneous action, an inverted succession of events, even. From these considerations we can see how late, strict, logical thought, the true notion of cause and effect, must have been in developing, since our intellectual and rational faculties to this very day revert to these primitive processes of deduction, while practically half our lifetime is spent in the superinducing conditions. Even the poet, the artist, ascribes to his sentimental and emotional states causes which are not the true ones. To that extent, he is a reminder of early mankind and can aid us in its comprehension. 14. Association. All strong feelings are associated with a variety of allied sentiments and emotions. They stir up the memory at the same time. When we are under their influence, we are reminded of similar states, and we feel a renewal of them within us. Thus are formed habitual successions of feelings and notions, which at last, when they follow one another with lightning rapidity, are no longer felt as complexities, but as unities. In this sense we hear of moral feelings, of religious feelings, as if they were absolute unities. In reality they are streams, with 100 sources and tributaries. Here again, the unity of the word speaks nothing for the unity of the thing. 15. Know within and without in the world. As Democritus transferred the notions above and below to limitless space, where they are destitute of meaning, so the philosophers do generally with the idea within and without, as regards the form and substance, Wesen und Erscheinung, of the world. What they claim is that through the medium of profound feelings, one can penetrate deep into the soul of things, draw close to the heart of nature. But these feelings are deep only in so far as with them are simultaneously aroused, although almost imperceptibly, certain complicated groups of thoughts, Gedankengruppen, which we call deep. A feeling is deep because we deem the thoughts accompanying it deep. But deep thought can nevertheless be very widely sundered from truth, as for instance every metaphysical thought. Take from deep feeling the element of thought blended with it, and all that remains is strength of feeling, which is no voucher for the validity of knowledge, as intense faith is evidence only of its own intensity, and not of the truth of that in which the faith is felt. 16. Phenomenon and thing in itself. The philosophers are in the habit of placing themselves in front of life and experience, that which they call the world of phenomena, as if they were standing before a picture that is unrolled before them in its final completeness. This panorama, they think, must be studied in every detail in order to reach some conclusion regarding the object represented by the picture. From effect, accordingly, is deduced cause, and from cause is deduced the unconditioned. This process is generally looked upon as affording the all-sufficient explanation of the world of phenomena. On the other hand, one must, while putting the conception of the metaphysical distinctly forward as that of the unconditioned, and consequently of the unconditioning, absolutely deny any connection between the unconditioned of the metaphysical world and the world known to us, so that throughout phenomena there is no manifestation of the thing in itself, and getting from one to the other is out of the question. Thus is left quite ignored the circumstance that the picture, that which we now call life and experience, is a gradual evolution, is indeed still in process of evolution, and for that reason should not be regarded as an enduring whole, from which any conclusion as to its author, the all-sufficient reason, could be arrived at, or even pronounced out of the question. It is because we have for thousands of years looked into the world with moral, aesthetic, religious predispositions, with blind prejudice, passion, or fear, and surfeited ourselves with indulgence in the follies of illogical thought, that the world has gradually become so wondrously motley, frightful, significant, soulful. It has taken on tints, but we have been the colorists. The human intellect, upon the foundation of human needs, of human passions, has reared all these phenomena and injected its own erroneous fundamental conceptions into things. Late, very late, the human intellect checks itself, and now the world of experience and the thing in itself seem to it so severed and so antithetical that it denies the possibility of one's hinging upon the other, or else summons us to surrender our intellect, our personal will, to the secret and the awe-inspiring, in order that thereby we may attain certainty of certainty hereafter. Again, there are those who have combined all the characteristic features of our world of phenomena, that is, the conception of the world which has been formed and inherited through a series of intellectual vagaries, and instead of holding the intellect responsible for it all, have pronounced the very nature of things accountable for the present, very sinister aspect of the world, and preached annihilation of existence. Through all these views and opinions, the toilsome, steady process of science, which now for the first time begins to celebrate its greatest triumph in the genesis of thought, will definitely work itself out, the result being, perhaps, to the following effect: that which we now call the world is the result of a crowd of errors and fancies which gradually developed in the general evolution of organic nature, have grown together and been transmitted to us as the accumulated treasure of all the past, as the treasure for whatever is worth anything in our humanity rests upon it. From this world of conception, it is in the power of science to release us only to a slight extent, and this is all that could be wished, inasmuch as it cannot eradicate the influence of hereditary habits of feeling, but it can light up by degrees the stages of the development of that world of conception, and lift us, at least for a time, above the whole spectacle. Perhaps we may then perceive that the thing in itself is a meet subject for Homeric laughter, that it seemed so much everything indeed, and is really a void, that is to say, of meaning. 17. Metaphysical explanation. Man, when he is young, prizes metaphysical explanations, because they make him see matters of the highest import in things he found disagreeable or contemptible, and if he is not satisfied with himself, This feeling of dissatisfaction is soothed when he sees the most hidden world problem or world pain in that which he finds so displeasing in himself. To feel himself more unresponsible, and at the same time to find things more interesting, that is to him the double benefit he owes to metaphysics. Later, indeed, he acquires distrust of the whole metaphysical method of explaining things. He then perceives, perhaps, that those effects could have been attained just as well and more scientifically by another method, that physical and historical explanations would, at least, have given that feeling of freedom from personal responsibility just as well, while interest in life and its problems would be stimulated, perhaps even more. 18. The fundamental problems of metaphysics. If a history of the development of thought is ever written, the following proposition, advanced by a distinguished logician, will be illuminated with a new light. The universal primordial law of the apprehending subject consists in the inner necessity of cognizing every object by itself, as in its essence a thing unto itself, therefore a self-existing and unchanging, in short, as a substance. Even this law, which is here called primordial, is an evolution. It has yet to be shown how gradually this evolution takes place in lower organizations, how the dim mole eyes of such organizations see at first nothing but a blank sameness, how later, when the various excitations of desire and aversion manifest themselves, various substances are gradually distinguished, but each with an attribute, that is, a special relationship to such an organization. The first step towards the logical is judgment, the essence of which, according to the best logicians, is belief. At the foundation of all beliefs lie sensations of pleasure or pain in relation to the apprehending subject. A third feeling, as the result of two prior, single, separate feelings, is judgment in its crudest form. We organic beings are primordially interested by nothing whatever in anything except its relation to ourselves with reference to pleasure and pain. Between the moments in which we are conscious of this relation, the states of feeling, lie the moments of rest, of not feeling. Then the world and everything have no interest for us. We observe no change in them, as at present a person absorbed in something does not notice anyone passing by. To plants all things are, as a rule, at rest, eternal, every object like itself. From the period of lower organisms has been handed down to man the belief that there are like things. Only the trained experience attained through the most advanced science contradicts this postulate. The primordial belief of all organisms is, perhaps, that all the rest of the world is one thing and motionless. Furthest away from this first step towards the logical is the notion of causation. Even today, we think that all our feelings and doings are, at bottom, acts of the free will. When the sentient individual contemplates himself, he deems every feeling, every change, as something isolated, disconnected, that is to say, unqualified by anything. It comes suddenly to the surface, independent of anything that went before or came after. We are hungry, but originally we do not know that the organism must be nourished. On the contrary, that feeling seems to manifest itself without reason or purpose. It stands out by itself and seems quite independent. Therefore, the belief in the freedom of the will is a primordial error of everything organic, as old as the very earliest inward prompting of the logical faculty. Belief in unconditioned substances and in like things, also a primordial and equally ancient error. everything organic, inasmuch as all metaphysic has concerned itself particularly with substance and with freedom of the will. It should be designated as the science that deals with the fundamental errors of mankind, as if they were fundamental truths. 19. Number. The invention of the laws of number has as its basis the primordial and prior prevailing delusion that many like things exist, although in point of fact there is no such thing as a duplicate, or that at least there are things, but there is no thing. The assumption of plurality always presupposes that something exists, which manifests itself repeatedly. But just here is where the delusion prevails. In this very matter we feign realities, unities, that have no existence. Our feelings, notions of space and time, are false, for they lead, when duly tested, to logical contradictions. In all scientific demonstrations, we always unavoidably base our calculation upon some false standards of duration or measurement. But as these standards are at least constant, as, for example, our notions of time and space, the results arrived at by science possess absolute accuracy and certainty in their relationship to one another. One can keep on building upon them until is reached that final limit at which the erroneous fundamental conceptions, the invariable breakdown, come into conflict with the results established, as for example, in the case of the atomic theory. Here we always find ourselves obliged to give credence to a thing or material substratum that is set in motion, although at the same time the whole scientific program has had as its aim the resolving of everything material into motions themselves. Here again we distinguish with our feeling that which does the moving and that which is moved, and we never get out of this circle, because the belief in things has been from time immemorial, rooted in our nature. When Kant says the intellect does not derive its laws from nature, but dictates them to her, he states the full truth as regards the idea of nature which we form. Nature equals world as notion, that is, as error, but which is merely the synthesis of a host of errors of the intellect. To a world not the outcome of our conception, the laws of number are wholly inapplicable. Such laws are valid only in the world of mankind. 20. Some backward steps. One very forward step in education is taken when man emerges from his superstitious and religious ideas and fears, and, for instance, no longer believes in the dear little angels or in original sin, and has stopped talking about the salvation of the soul. When he has taken this step to freedom, he has, nevertheless, through the utmost exertion of his mental power, to overcome metaphysics. Then a backward movement is necessary. He must appreciate the historical justification, and to an equal extent the psychological considerations in such a movement. He must understand that the greatest advances made by mankind have resulted from such a course, and that without this very backward movement, the highest achievements of man hitherto would have been impossible. With regard to philosophical metaphysics, I see ever more and more who have arrived at the negative goal, that all positive metaphysic is a delusion, but as yet very few who go a few steps backward. One should look out over the last rungs of the ladder, but not try to stand on them, that is to say. The most advanced as yet go only far enough to free themselves from metaphysics and look back at it with an air of superiority, whereas here, no less than in the hippodrome, it is necessary to turn around in order to reach the end of the course. 21. Nature of the victory of doubt. Let us assume for a moment the validity of the skeptical standpoint. Granted that there is no metaphysical world, and that all the metaphysical explanations of the only world we know are useless to us, how would we then contemplate men and things? This can be thought out, and it is worthwhile doing so, even if the question whether anything metaphysical has ever been demonstrated by or through Kant and Schopenhauer be put altogether aside, for it is, to all appearances, highly probable that men, on this point, will be, in the mass, skeptical. The question thus becomes, what sort of a notion will human society, under the influence of such a state of mind, form of itself? Perhaps the scientific demonstration of any metaphysical world is now so difficult that mankind will never be free from a distrust of it. And when there is formed a feeling of distrust of metaphysics, the results are, in the mass, the same as if metaphysics were refuted altogether and could no longer be believed. In both cases, the historical question, with regard to an unmetaphysical disposition in mankind, remains the same. 22. Disbelief in the monumentum aer perennius. A decided disadvantage attending the termination of metaphysical modes of thought is that the individual fixes his mind too attentively upon his own brief lifetime and feels no strong inducement to aid in the foundation of institutions capable of enduring for centuries. He wishes himself to gather the fruit from the tree that he plants, and consequently he no longer plants those trees which require centuries of constant cultivation and are destined to afford shade to generation after generation in the future. For metaphysical views inspire the belief that in them is afforded the final sure foundation upon which henceforth the whole future of mankind may rest and be built up. The individual promotes his own salvation. When, for example, he builds a church or a monastery, he is of opinion that he is doing something for the salvation of his immortal soul. Can science as well inspire such faith in the efficacy of her results? In actual fact, science requires doubt and distrust as her surest auxiliaries. Nevertheless, the sum of the irresistible, that is all the onslaughts of skepticism, all the disintegrating effects of surviving truths, can easily become so great, as for instance, in the case of hygienic science, as to inspire the determination to build eternal works upon it. At present, the contrast between our excitated ephemeral existence and the tranquil repose of metaphysical epochs is too great, because both are as yet in too close juxtaposition. The individual man himself now goes through too many stages of inner and outer evolution for him to venture to make a plan, even for his lifetime alone. A perfectly modern man, indeed, who wants to build himself a house, feels as if he were walling himself up, alive in a mausoleum. 23. Age of comparison. The less men are bound by tradition, the greater is the inner activity of motives, the greater, correspondingly, the outer restlessness, the promiscuous flow of humanity, the polyphony of strivings. Who now feels any great impulse to establish himself and his posterity in a particular place? For whom, moreover, does there exist at present any strong tie? As all the methods of the arts were copied from one another, so were all the methods and advancements of moral codes, of manners, of civilizations. Such an age derives its significance from the fact that in it the various ideas, codes, manners, and civilizations can be compared and experienced side by side, which was impossible at an earlier period in view of the localized nature of the rule of every civilization, corresponding to the limitation of all artistic effects by time and place. Today the growth of the aesthetic feeling is decided, owing to the great number of artistic forms which offer themselves for comparison. The majority, those that are condemned by the method of comparison, will be allowed to die out. In the same way, there is today taking place a selection of the forms and customs of the higher morality, which can result only in the extinction of the vulgar moralities. This is the age of comparison. That is its glory, but also its pain. Let us not, however, shrink from this pain. Rather would we comprehend the nature of the task imposed upon us by our age as adequately as we can. Posterity will bless us for doing so, a posterity that knows itself to be developed through and above the narrow, early race civilizations, as well as the culture civilization of comparison, but yet looks gratefully back upon both as venerable monuments of antiquity. 24. Possibility of progress. Possibility of progress. When a master of the old civilization, den alten Kultur, vows to hold no more discussion with men who believe in progress, he is quite right. For the old civilization has its greatness and its advantages behind it, and historic training forces one to acknowledge that it can never again acquire vigor. Only intolerable stupidity, or equally intolerable fanaticism, could fail to perceive this fact. But men may consciously determine to evolve to a new civilization, where formerly they evolved unconsciously and accidentally. They can now devise better conditions for the advancement of mankind, for their nourishment, training, and education. They can administer the earth as an economic power, and particularly compare the capacities of men and select them accordingly. This new conscious civilization is killing the other, which on the whole has led but an unreflective animal and plant life. It is also destroying the doubt of progress itself. Progress is possible. I mean, it is hasty and almost unreflective to assume that progress must necessarily take place. But how can it be doubted that progress is possible? On the other hand, progress in the sense and along the lines of the old civilization is not even conceivable. If romantic fantasy employs the word progress in connection with certain aims and ends identical with those of the circumscribed primitive national civilizations, the picture presented of progress is always borrowed from the past. The idea and the image of progress thus formed are quite without originality. 25. Private ethics and world ethics. Since the extinction of the belief that a God guides the general destiny of the world, and notwithstanding all the contortions and windings of the path of mankind, leads it gloriously forward, men must shape ecumenical, world-embracing ends for themselves. The older ethics, namely Kant's, required of the individual such a course of conduct as he wishes all men to follow. This evinces much simplicity, as if any individual could determine offhand what course of conduct would conduce to the welfare of humanity, and what course of conduct is preeminently desirable. This is a theory like that of freedom of competition, which takes it for granted that the general harmony must prevail of itself in accordance with some inherent law of betterment or amelioration. It may be that a later contemplation of the needs of mankind will reveal that it is by no means desirable that all men should regulate their conduct according to the same principle. It may be best, from the standpoint of certain ends yet to be attained, that men, during long periods, should regulate their conduct with reference to special, and even, in certain circumstances, evil objects. At any rate, if mankind is not to be led astray by such a universal rule of conduct, it behooves it to attain a knowledge of the condition of culture that will serve as a scientific standard of comparison in connection with cosmical ends. Herein is comprised the tremendous mission of the great spirits of the next century. 26. Reaction as progress. Occasionally harsh, powerful, impetuous, yet nevertheless backward spirits appear, who try to conjure back some past era in the history of mankind. They serve as evidence that the new tendencies which they oppose are not yet potent enough, that there is something lacking in them. Otherwise the tendencies would better withstand the effects of this conjuring back process. Thus Luther's Reformation shows that in his century all the impulses to freedom of the spirit were still uncertain, lacking in vigor, and immature. Science could not yet rear her head. Indeed, the whole Renaissance appears but as an early spring smothered in snow. But even in the present century, Schopenhauer's metaphysic shows that the scientific spirit is not yet powerful enough for the whole medieval Christian world standpoint, Weltbetrachtung, and conception of man. Once again, notwithstanding the slowly wrought destruction of all Christian dogma, celebrated a resurrection in Schopenhauer's doctrine. There is much science in his teaching, although the science does not dominate, but instead of it, the old, trite, metaphysical necessity. It is one of the greatest and most priceless advantages of Schopenhauer's teaching, that by it our feelings are temporarily forced back to those old human and cosmical standpoints to which no other path could conduct us so easily. The gain for history and justice is very great. I believe that without Schopenhauer's aid, it would be no easy matter for anyone now to do justice to Christianity and its Asiatic relatives, a thing impossible as regards the Christianity that still survives. After according this great triumph to justice, after we have corrected in so essential a respect the historical point of view which the age of learning brought with it, we may begin to bear still farther onward the banner of enlightenment, a banner bearing the three names, Petrarch, Erasmus, Voltaire. We have taken a forward step out of reaction. 27. A substitute for religion. It is supposed to be a recommendation for philosophy, to say of it that it provides the people with a substitute for religion. And in fact, the training of the intellect does necessitate the convenient laying out of the track of thought, since the transition from religion by way of science entails a powerful, perilous leap, something that should be advised against. With this qualification, the recommendation referred to is a just one. At the same time, it should be further explained that the needs which religion satisfies and which science must now satisfy are not immutable. Even they can be diminished and uprooted. Think, for instance, of the Christian soul need, the sighs over one's inner corruption, the anxiety regarding salvation, all notions that arise simply out of errors of the reason and require no satisfaction at all, but annihilation. A philosophy can either so affect these needs as to appease them, or else put them aside altogether, for they are acquired, circumscribed needs, based upon hypotheses which those of science explode. Here, for the purpose of affording the means of transition, for the sake of lightening the spirit, overburdened with feeling, art can be employed to far better purpose, as these hypotheses receive far less support from art than from a metaphysical philosophy. Then from art it is easier to go over to a really emancipating philosophical science. 28. Discredited words. Away with the disgustingly overused words, optimism and pessimism, for the occasion for using them grows daily less. Only drivellers now find them indispensably necessary. What earthly reason could anyone have for being an optimist, unless he had a God to defend, who must have created the best of all possible worlds, since he is himself all goodness and perfection. But what thinking man has now any need for the hypothesis that there is a God? There is also no occasion whatever for a pessimistic confession of faith, unless one has a personal interest in denouncing the advocate of God, the theologian, or the theological philosopher, and maintaining the counter-proposition that evil reigns, that wretchedness is more potent than joy, that the world is a piece of botchwork, that phenomenon, Erscheinung, is but the manifestation of some evil spirit. But who bothers his head about the theologians anymore, except the theologians themselves? Apart from all theology and its antagonism, it is manifest that the world is neither good nor bad, to say nothing about its being the best or the worst, and that these ideas of good and bad have significance only in relation to men, indeed are without significance at all, in view of the sense in which they are usually employed. The contemptuous and the eulogistic point of view must, in every case, be repudiated. 29. Intoxicated by the perfume of flowers, the ship of humanity, it is thought, acquires an ever deeper draught, the more it is laden. It is believed that the more profoundly man thinks, the more exquisitely he feels, the higher the standard he sets for himself, the greater his distance from the other animals, the more he appears as a genie, among animals, the nearer he gets to the true nature of the world and to comprehension thereof. This indeed he really does through science, but he thinks he does it far more adequately through his religions and arts. These are certainly a blossoming of the world, but not therefore nearer the roots of the world than is the stalk. One cannot learn best from it the nature of the world, although nearly everyone thinks so. Error has made men so deep, sensitive, and imaginative in order to bring forth such flowers as religions and arts. Pure apprehension would be unable to do that. Whoever should disclose to us the essence of the world would be undeceiving us most cruelly. Not the world as thing in itself, but the world as idea, as error, is rich in portent, deep, wonderful, carrying happiness and unhappiness in its womb. This result leads to a philosophy of world negation, which at any rate can be as well combined with a practical world affirmation as with its opposite. 30. Evil habits in reaching conclusions. The most usual erroneous conclusions of men are these: a thing exists, therefore it is right. Here from capacity to live is deduced fitness, from fitness is deduced justification. So also, an opinion gives happiness, therefore it is the true one. Its effect is good, therefore it is itself good and true. Here is predicated of the effect that it gives happiness, that it is good in the sense of utility, and there is likewise predicated of the cause that it is good, but good in the sense of logical validity. Conversely, the proposition would run: a thing cannot attain success, cannot maintain itself, therefore it is evil. A belief troubles the believer, occasions pain, therefore it is false. The free spirit, who is sensible of the defect in this method of reaching conclusions and has had to suffer its consequences, often succumbs to the temptation to come to the very opposite conclusions, which in general are, of course, equally erroneous. A thing cannot maintain itself, therefore it is good. A belief is troublesome, therefore it is true. 31. The illogical is necessary. Among the things which can bring a thinker to distraction is the knowledge that the illogical is necessary to mankind, and that from the illogical springs much that is good. The illogical is so embedded in the passions, in language, in art, in religion, and above all, in everything that imparts value to life, that it cannot be taken away without irreparably injuring those beautiful things. Only men of the utmost simplicity can believe that the nature man knows can be changed into a purely logical nature. Yet were there steps affording approach to this goal, how utterly everything would be lost on the way. Even the most rational man needs nature again from time to time. That is his illogical, fundamental relation to all things. 32. Being unjust is essential. All judgments of the value of life are illogically developed, and therefore unjust. The vice of the judgment consists, first, in the way in which the subject matter comes under observation, that is, very incompletely. Secondly, in the way in which the total is summed up, and thirdly, in the fact that each single item in the totality of the subject matter is itself the result of defective perception, and this from absolute necessity. No practical knowledge of a man, for example, stood he never so near to us, can be complete, so that we could have a logical right to form a total estimate of him. All estimates are summary, and must be so. Then the standard by which we measure our being is not an immutable quantity. We have moods and variations, and yet we should know ourselves as an invariable standard before we undertake to establish the nature of the relation of anything, Sasha, to ourselves. Perhaps it will follow from all this that one should form no judgments whatever, if one could but merely live without having to form estimates, without aversion, and without partiality. For everything most abhorred is closely connected with an estimate, as well as every strongest partiality. An inclination towards a thing, or from a thing, without an accompanying feeling that the beneficial is desired and the pernicious contemned, an inclination without a sort of experiential estimation of the desirability of an end, does not exist in man. We are primordially illogical, and hence unjust beings, and can recognize this fact. This is one of the greatest and most baffling discords of existence. 33. Error respecting living for the sake of living. Every belief in the value and worthiness of life rests upon defective thinking. It is for this reason alone possible that sympathy with the general life and suffering of mankind is so imperfectly developed in the individual. Even exceptional men, who can think beyond their own personalities, do not have this general life in view, but isolated portions of it. If one is capable of fixing his observation upon exceptional cases, I mean upon highly endowed individuals and pure-souled beings, if their development is taken as the true end of world evolution, and if joy be felt in their existence, then it is possible to believe in the value of life, because in that case, the rest of humanity is overlooked. Hence we have here defective thinking. So too it is even if all mankind be taken into consideration, and one species only of impulses, the less egoistic, brought under review, and those, in consideration of the other impulses, exalted, then something could still be hoped of mankind in the mass, and to that extent there could exist belief in the value of life, here, again, as a result of defective thinking. Whatever attitude, thus, one may assume, one is, as a result of this attitude, an exception among mankind. Now the great majority of mankind endure life without any great protest, and believe to this extent in the value of existence. But that is because each individual decides and determines alone, and never comes out of his own personality, like these exceptions. Everything outside of the personal has no existence for them, or at the utmost is observed as but a faint shadow. Consequently, the value of life for the generality of mankind consists simply in the fact that the individual attaches more importance to himself than he does to the world. The great lack of imagination from which he suffers is responsible for his inability to enter into the feelings of beings other than himself, and hence his sympathy with their fate and suffering is of the slightest possible description. On the other hand, whosoever really could sympathize necessarily doubts the value of life. Were it possible for him to sum up and to feel in himself the total consciousness of mankind, he would collapse with a malediction against existence, for mankind is, in the mass, without a goal, and hence man cannot find, in the contemplation of his whole course, anything to serve him as a mainstay and a comfort, but rather a reason to despair. If he looks beyond the things that immediately engage him to the final aimlessness of humanity, his own conduct assumes in his eyes the character of a frittering away. To feel oneself, however, as humanity, not alone as an individual, frittered away exactly as we see the stray leaves frittered away by nature, is a feeling transcending all feeling. But who is capable of it? Only a poet, certainly, and poets always know how to console themselves. 34. For tranquility. But will not our philosophy become thus a tragedy? Will not truth prove the enemy of life, of betterment? A question seems to weigh upon our tongue, and yet will not put itself into words. Whether one can knowingly remain in the domain of the untruthful, or if one must, whether then death would not be preferable, for there is no longer any ought, solemn, morality. So far as it is involved, ought is through our point of view as utterly annihilated as religion. Our knowledge can permit only pleasure and pain, benefit and injury, to subsist as motives. But how can these motives be distinguished from the desire for truth? Even they rest upon error. In so far as already stated, partiality and dislike and their very inaccurate estimates palpably modify our pleasure and our pain. The whole of human life is deeply involved in untruth. The individual cannot extricate it from this pit without thereby fundamentally clashing with his whole past, without finding his present motives of conduct, as that of honor, illegitimate, and without opposing scorn and contempt to the ambitions which prompt one to have regard for the future and for one's happiness in the future. Is it true? Does there then remain but one way of thinking, which as a personal consequence brings in its train despair, and as a theoretical consequence brings in its train a philosophy of decay, disintegration, self-annihilation? I believe the deciding influence as regards the after-effect of knowledge will be the temperament of a man. I can, in addition to this after-effect just mentioned, the idea of a much simpler life and one freer from disturbances than the present could be lived, so that at first the old motives of vehement passion might still have strength, owing to hereditary habit, but they would gradually grow weaker under the influence of purifying knowledge. A man would live at last, both among men and unto himself, as in the natural state, without praise, reproach, competition, feasting one's eyes, as if it were a play, upon much that formerly inspired dread. One would be rid of the strenuous element, and would no longer feel the goad of the reflection that man is not even as much as nature, nor more than nature. To be sure, this requires, as already stated, a good temperament, a fortified, gentle, and naturally cheerful soul, a disposition that has no need to be on its guard against its own eccentricities and sudden outbreaks, and that in its utterances manifests neither sullenness nor a snarling tone, those familiar, disagreeable characteristics of old dogs and old men that have been a long time chained up. Rather must a man, from whom the ordinary bondages of life have fallen away to so great an extent, so do that he only lives on in order to grow continually in knowledge and to learn to resign, without envy and without disappointment, much, yes, nearly everything that has value in the eyes of men. He must be content with such a free, fearless soaring above men, manners, laws, and traditional estimates of things as the most desirable of all situations. He will freely share the joy of being in such a situation, and he has, perhaps, nothing else to share, in which renunciation and self-denial really most consist. But if more is asked of him, he will, with a benevolent shake of the head, refer to his brother, the free man of fact, and will perhaps not dissemble a little contempt, for as regards his freedom, thereby hangs a tale